Good evening, everyone. I'm Bresheeth-Zabner. On behalf of Jewish Network for Palestine, I'm happy to welcome you to this important event, the first in a series of three. There are about 60 of you on Zoom, and some will be there on Facebook streaming soon, as we are filling our quota on Zoom. I have a few short announcements. Please, can I ask you all to mute yourself now if you're not already muted, and disconnect your video through the little button on the bottom left of the screen. You may reconnect your video at the Q&A stage. This event is being recorded and will be shared on our JNP website later this week. The Q&A session will take place immediately after the talk, of about 45 minutes duration or so. To pose a question, put it in the chat directly addressed to the host and raise your electronic hand if connected by Zoom. Please wait to be asked. I hope we shall not experience intentional disruption. Any attempt at disruption will lead to immediate expulsion from the webinar. Finally, I wish to thank the chair of JNP, David Cannon, our host for tonight, for dealing with the technical aspects behind the scenes. Allow me to say a few words on the topic and its importance before introducing our esteemed speaker, Dr. Moshe Behar, better known to his friends as Shiko. Shiko told me some weeks ago, when we discussed this series of lectures, that this event is the first of its kind in the UK or the US. In organizing this series, with that in mind, we are trying to address this lacuna on the topic in Britain. I hope that other events may follow. We all witness the growing public awareness and understanding of Israeli apartheid towards the Palestinians, following the publications of a number of key reports, on which we hope soon to hold a separate webinar about. There is much less understanding or public awareness of the other victims of Zionist racism within the Jewish community in Israel, the Mizrahim, though they number 50% or more of all Israeli Jews. The other, so to speak, of the Zionist self, the survivors of the death camps have also suffered from denial and repression, but not as seriously as the Mizrahim, for sure. Both communities suffered from hostility and denial of their history, language, and culture. But the treatment of the Mizrahim has all the traits of severe racism and left its marks on Israeli society even to this day. The Arab Jews, a term first used by Ella Shochat, have been racialized by the state, placed on the new borders of Israel as a human tripwire, in terrible conditions, and were, for all intents and purposes, isolated from the economy, culture, and social life of the Israeli state in ways resembling other racialized communities in the West much earlier. To quote Ella Shochat, the mythologized Sabra signifies paradoxically the destruction of the diasporic Jewish entity it claimed to rescue. To introduce the topic and the series, we are fortunate to have with us Moshe Behar, a dear friend and colleague. Dr. Moshe Behar is a leading Mizrahi scholar and activist. He holds a PhD in comparative politics from Columbia University and is senior lecturer and program director of the Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Manchester. His work, which includes too many titles to read here, includes the anthology Modern Middle Eastern Jewish Thought, Writings on Identity, Politics, and Culture, 1893 to 1958. He has also published research on the IHRA, Israel and anti-Semitism, and crucially for this evening's lecture, work on the Mizrahi Ashkenazi controversy, which I'm sure he will relate to tonight. Shiko is a long-term activist towards just peace in Israel-Palestine and the ideal person to introduce this series. Please welcome Dr. Moshe Behar, whose topic tonight is Nullified by the Holocaust and Nakba, Arabised-Jews, 1937 to 1956. Please, Shiko, you may start now.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Chaim and David. I do hope you hear me. You do, right?
Yes, of course.
Great. So I'm with COVID, so self-isolating, and that happened in the last 3 days. So I'm not in my own room, disrupted a little bit everything that I'm doing, but I hope it will be okay. Worst case scenario, I'm going to Zoom myself and cough or something, but otherwise I'm fine. Chaim and David, I mean, I'm not a member of the network maybe yet, but your enthusiasm and energy, I mean, I really appreciate the fact that you really enabled this thing to come up, especially you, Chaim. It's really unusual and exceptional. I mean, I've been teaching in the United Kingdom, in the UK, 15 years that I'm here. I mean, never got interest from too many constituencies out there, Zionist or anti-Zionist, by the way. There is a kind of an interesting, it's a concert that nobody, in a way, invites us too much. So, I mean, I hope to, to start something here. That's the hope. So let me share the screen. Here we are, I think. Slideshow from beginning. Right. I hope you see everything, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So that's the From Arab Jews to Israel and Mizrahim, a series of Jewish Network for Palestine webinar. And today we start the first one. Let me start with 3 contextual notes for the series in general, rather than my own talk, which I'm going to reach in a second. Tzvi Ben-Dor, Hila, Dayan, and myself, we know each other 30 years, more or less. We are independent Mizrahi voices. We represent no official body other than ourselves. But at the same time, I think it's safe to say that we are affiliates of a school of thought and activism that articulates a democratic, socialist, feminist, Mizrahi voice, of course, chiefly in Israel. All of us are Israelis, by the way. And this voice is first in relation to Israel-Palestine, but also in relation to the Middle East. That's why I put it in red. It's not only about Palestine, Israel, but the whole Middle East, and also the democratic, socialist, feminist, Mizrahi voice, right, also speaks about the world. So that's what we do. Now, the second note is the forthcoming talks, including the one here today, is tailored chiefly to the principal Jewish Network for Palestine constituency, okay? So why it is tailored to a specific constituency? Because our aim is to maximize gain. So why I'm saying it, because I did notice now there are 70 people or so people. There are, for example, I think high proportion of native Hebrew speakers today here, a lot, which of course thrills me because these are people that I respect, including colleagues and friends of all time. So I want to say to them, I mean, I'm speaking today to the constituency of a Jewish Network for Palestine, chiefly a non-anti-Zionist Jewish constituency that supports BDS, I think, and it is to them I'm talking about, and the other people are secondary right now because that's a conversation. Suppose that I was invited tomorrow by the, I don't know, Jewish Center in Manchester, right? And I'm not, yeah. I would have tailored the talk to them, you know, because I want to maximize gain. So this is what we are going to do here. I start today, but Hila and Tzvi are going to do the same. I mean, trying to address this constituency, which is dear to us and important. So wait a second, how do I, yeah, here, I think I work. Right, so now let me start with the, sorry, it always happens, right. I'm going to the third note, Arab and Mizrahi Jews. Let's start with numbers, if you don't mind. So get a sense. Before 1948, right, we are talking about roughly 780,000 individuals. These 780,000 individuals comprise small minority communities in 9 Arab states, right? In fact, there are also Jews in some additional places in Bahrain and some of the Gulf states, which I did not mention here, but forget them for a second because it's relatively very small. The states that are listed here are the main states that include a minority Jewish community. So that's the number, 780,000. I need to also speak about Ottoman Palestine, right? Because bear in mind, the Jews indigenous to Palestine are also Mizrahi Jews. I'm speaking here about Jewish presence that predates Zionism. So this is something that I think I thought to note. If we go all the way back to 1890 in Palestine, so you can see in the table here, you have 43,000 Jews in Palestine at the time. In 1890, there are 500,000 people in Palestine, 530,000. And the Jewish community of 1890 Palestine constitutes 8% of the total population. Okay, 1914, it's a little bit more. You have 13%, so it's 94,000 Jews altogether. Here we are. Now, I'm stopping in 1914 because I'm doing a bit of a, I'm saying the following. If you read the charter of the Palestinian Liberation Organization from 1964 and also the revised version of 1968, right? From the perspective of the Palestinian National Movement, all the Jews that were present on the ground in Ottoman Palestine up to the Balfour Declaration, right, are Palestinians. Palestinian Jews, right, indigenous Palestinian Jews. I'm, by the way, one of them, okay, because my family is from Palestine too. So what I'm saying here is that Palestinian Jews, those that were in Palestine and live in Palestine, are also included as Mizrahim because Palestine is Arab at the time, and they are in some respects Arab Jews. So this is the total numbers. Now, from 1949, and never mind now why, right? There is a beginning of a dispersal, en masse dispersal of Jews from the Arab world, right? So what happens then? 1/3 of the 780,000 Jews in the countries surrounding Palestine eventually end up in Europe or the Americas, Western Europe or the South North America, and also Canada, by the way, but this is North America. So I'm not speaking about these guys today because they are very small, 200, not small, 250,000 all over the world. So, and now 2/3 of the Arab Jews or the Jews that were in the Middle East before 1949 or 48 are Jews that ended up in what I call infant Israel, right? And all of them together are about 500,000 people. So these 500,000 people began to moved in the 1950s mainly and arrived in Israel. Let me just note something that I suspect that many people who don't know except the maybe native Hebrew speakers. By the year 1958, the Jewish community of Israel, right? I'm not speaking about the Palestinian citizens of Israel, only the Jews. By 1958, Mizrahi Jews, Oriental Mizrahi Jews, constitute the majority of the Jewish population in Israel, 1958. And this is going to be until 1992, but then it changed because Israel imported a lot of Russian Jews, and then the balance changed, but that's separate. Huh? Now, a quick note, white Jews or Euro-American Jews or Ashkenazi Jews comprise the great majority of world Jewry, okay? But Israel Jews of non-European origin comprise 50% of the Jewish population of Israel. So what I'm saying is, for people who maybe lost this point, that Israel, on the one hand, and the Jewish world, on the other hand, are very, very, very different, okay? And they are different in many respects because Israel is, of course, more Mizrahi than the world. So all my colleagues here in the UK, think for a second, do a little exercise, right? When was the last time you met or spoke to a non-white Jew, a Mizrahi Jew? Well, it didn't happen a lot, okay? When was the last time you heard a lecture by a non-Ashkenazi Jew? You didn't. When was the last time that you had coffee with a non-Ashkenazi Jew? I mean,
as your business evolves for the future, your teams and culture should change.
Can someone mute? Yeah. So perhaps this is also the reason why the Mizrahi question doesn't really bother Zionists or anti-Zionists in the West. Okay, they don't deal with it at all. Right. I'm moving to the 21st century to speak about Mizrahim in the 21st century. And here, most of them are overwhelmingly in Israel-Palestine. So they are roughly 3.4 million Mizrahim today. The last thing that needs to be noted is that in ethno-class terms, right, Mizrahim or non-white or non-Ashkenazi Jews continue to be overrepresented in the lower Jewish enclaves in Israel. Of course, that we never forget the Palestinian Arabs who are not Jews, and Palestinian Arabs in Israel, including citizens, of course, sometimes are located below non-white or Eastern Jews. We know it, but today we talk about Mizrahi Jews. But in light of everything that I discussed today, I want to emphasize one thing. It can be very productive for everyone to recite the fact that Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews are not the same, okay? Their lived experience is markedly different inside and also outside Israel-Palestine. They have different history, different experience. They are not the same. And I suggest that everybody needs to remember the fact that Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews are not the same. Also, the Palestinians and the Arabs and their supporters, they need to understand it. Because if someone is negating the fact that there is a difference between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi,
Hi, everyone. How are you?
please mute yourselves, people, okay? Thank you. It means it's a negation of the humanity of Mizrahi people. Let's think of myself, for example, when I'm walking outside the street a day after Brexit in a tram in Manchester, right? My experience or my lived experience is the experience of an Asian Brit. That's what I am, huh? A so-called BAME, huh? So our experiences as Mizrahim is different in Israel, but also in the UK. And we ask people to, in a way, remember that. It's important. Now, Mizrahim, in many respects, have so-called two histories. They have a pre-Israel, Ottoman or Arab history, right? And then they have a post-1950 in Israel history. I'm talking about the 500 or 500,000 Arab Jews that ended up in Israel. I'm not talking about the 250,000 that left for the other places in the world. So what I'm saying, if Mizrahim have two histories, so to speak, this is their trajectory. So I'm asking you to consider, can one make sense of Arab and or Palestinian history after the year 1948 without studying Arab or Palestinian history before 1948? My answer is not really. You can't understand the Palestinians after 1948 if you don't understand Palestinians before 1948. So what I propose to you, that the same case goes for Mizrahi Jews. So the history of Arab Jews and Mizrahim, one, did not start inside Israel, right? And secondly, our history is not confined to either the history or the territory of Palestine, Israel, with all the respect to Palestine, Israel, and we do have a respect to it. So what does it mean? It means that instead, if you are interested in Mizrahi history, then please remember that Mizrahi history is part and parcel of the history of the entire Middle East. So now, let's take now the Jewish Network for Palestine. I brought these two maps and that I think that they depict the nexus of your activity. All the tensions that the network addresses are between these two polar issues, right? Everything is there. So if I'm now trying to integrate the Mizrahi question into the network, the problem is that it is not enough. Why? Because you cannot understand Mizrahi history only post 1948, okay? So, because for Mizrahi history needs this map, okay? So Israel-Palestine is of course included, this little place there that generates so much pain for so many people and so much interest, but you cannot understand the history of Mizrahi Jews without discussing the history of the Middle East, because the history of the Middle East, including Arab history, is our history, right? It's not a history that is alien to us. This is us, okay? So the school that I represent, socialist, democratic, feminist school that presents a specific Mizrahi perspective, we don't pretend to be the majority or something, right? This is the terms of reference of its discussion. And I'm just going back to the very first text that I, for example, published. It was in 1997 in English. So when I was a PhD student, through the Alternative Information Center, it is from January of 1997. And the title of the piece that I contributed back then to the issue was, is the Mizrahi question relevant to the future of the entire Middle East question mark? You can see it here. It's Ella Shochat is here, Sami Shalom Shitret, Tzvi Bendor is with me, and I'm due. That was my contribution. So what I'm proposing to you, it's been at least since 1997 that Mizrahi democratic socialists like ourselves say that this is the case. The fact that, of course, nobody hears us and nobody accepts maybe our thesis, it's a different matter. But at least we did say it and still continue to say that this is how it is best to make sense of us individually and collectively. Right. So now the final note, there exists a division of labor out there. I'm speaking about Euro-America now. I'm not speaking about Israel, to all the native Hebrew speakers around here. There's a division of labor between scholars and activists in Euro-America in relation to Mizrahi history. So this is the division of labor between Zionists and anti-Zionists, right? Zionists in Euro-America, yeah? They have a perverted love with the pre-Israel history of Mizrahi Jews. So they are very, very interested. Zionists are very interested in our Arab history, right? Why are they so interested in our Arab history? Because they think that if they're going to study it carefully, it will help them to defeat the Palestinian cause, right? So they're going to go there and just say how terrible the lives of Jews under Arab and Islamic rule was. They're going to invent the phrase Jewish Nakba. They're going to say that Jews that left the Arab states are as refugees as the Palestinians that were expelled in 1948. This is why they are interested in our Arab history. There's a sentence in Hebrew that says, "Lo me'avat Mordechai ela mesinat Haman." Not for the love of Mordechai, but for the hatred of Haman, one engages in something. And that's what explains that it's not that because they love us so much, or our being in before 1948, they do it simply because they think that it can be instrumental in relation to their attempt to undermine the Palestinian cause. Now, these same people that care so much about our pre-Israel history say nothing about our experiences inside Israel. So this doesn't concern them in Israel chapters of our history. So they don't address Israeli Orientalism. They don't address Israeli Eurocentrism. They don't address Israel racism. They don't understand Israel apartheid and crimes. And by the way, when I say apartheid, I'm not talking about apartheid vis-a-vis Palestinians. I'm talking about apartheid vis-a-vis Mizrahim. I mean, we were not able to even join kibbutzim in a way. They were uni-ethnic white Jewish kibbutzim. Our houses were destroyed as late as 2 weeks in Tel Aviv, and we didn't hear any constituency in the West, pro-Israel, pro-Zionist constituency, including those that deals with us, saying something about these crimes. Right, so this is the Zionists. Let's move to the anti-Zionists, if you don't mind. So the anti-Zionists in Euro-America, I'm not speaking now about Israel, are expressing what I call reserved and kind of a bit cold interest in our post-1950 in Israel history. So sometimes they're interested in our experiences inside the state of Israel. And why they're interested? They're interested because if you study our history inside Israel, it can help you, it can strengthen your Palestinian argument. Because you can, for example, see that the state of Israel is not racist only vis-a-vis non-Jewish Palestinians, but is also racist against non-white Jews. So this is the reason that sometimes it's not too complicated for anti-Zionists in Euro-America to sympathize with the Mizrahi experience inside Israel. At the same time, the same anti-Zionists hardly express any interest in our pre-Israel history. They don't talk a lot, I didn't hear them talk a lot about the history of Jews before they ended up in Israel. They are interested in our experiences inside Israel. So this is what I call the division of labor between the two groups in Euro-America in relation to Mizrahi history. And I suspect that not everybody is going to agree with me, which is totally fine, but later on we can discuss it. So the three meetings that we are planning here simply aim to shed some explanatory light on the Mizrahi trajectory before and after 1948. And the first talk takes place now, and it is titled Nullified by Holocaust and Nakba, Arabised-Jews 1937 to 1956. Hila could not be here, but Zvi is here. I'm going to say something bold. I think that probably my talk is the most complex out of the three. And the reason is that my talk, given the years, is going to address much more the pre-Israel or pre-1948 Arab history of Mizrahi Jews, which I would tell you empirically is of no great concern to pro-Palestinian, Euro-American academia and activists. This is an empirical statement, people. I mean, it's not pro-Palestinian, Euro-American academia and activists are not interested in the Arab history of the Mizrahi. I mean, they simply, I don't see anyone speaks about it, which is totally fine. Most of them also, in my view, cannot detect the profound linkage of this Arab history of the Mizrahim to what I call the monumental defeat of Arab and Palestinian nationalism by Ashkenazi Zionism. Ashkenazi Zionism managed to defeat Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism. What I suggest is that if you understand properly the Arab history of Mizrahi Jews, you may be able to explain better this outcome. That's a proposition. Right. And lastly, a note, nullified, I use the word nullified, should be understood today metaphorically rather than legally. I'm married to a barrister, and also, if I'm not mistaken, a professor of Jewish law is supposed to be here, who was a colleague of mine. So I understand the nullified here as to deprive an individual or a collectivity of effective or continued existence, to counter their very historical being, social effectiveness, and cultural value. And what I say, nullified by Palestinian Nakba and Jewish Holocaust. That's the suggestion here. So Nakba, I hope that I don't need to explain to this constituency what Nakba is. So this is the Palestinian Nakba, loss of land. More important in my view than the loss of land is the human toll. And this map depicts the real Nakba in my view, the exiling of the Palestinian people from their homeland, 750 people that were moved out, expelled, the complete breakdown of indigenous Palestinian society in Palestine. So that's the Nakba, which I'm not going to discuss today. Let's go to the Holocaust, if you don't mind. What you see here is the chart of the Nuremberg laws of Germany from 1935. That's the racist legislation that Hitler and his associates came with. This defines who is a pure Aryan and who is a Jew, and later on who is going to die and stay alive. So the Nuremberg laws. I do put the yellow star because, amazing as it is, I notice every year for year one students that I teach, Briton, 18 years old, British people that have good A levels that come, at least 10% of them don't know what this is. So this is just, I'm telling you that that's the case. So also something that, conveys the Jewish Holocaust, of course. And then the map of the complete control of Nazi Germany over the world up to late 1942. So now here I want to say a few more words about the Holocaust, or mostly about the Second World War. Sadly, the Holocaust is not something that is completely exclusive to Europe or to East Jews. Why? Because Nazi and fascist Europe in the late 1930s and early 1940s is unfortunately either physically present or to some extent ideologically present in North Africa and the Asian Middle East. So for example, you can see the red map here. Of course, not everybody is as neutral as Switzerland here, the yellow, right? So the North African states are anyway under the control of Italy, some part of it, and Vichy France is going to still have an effect in Morocco and Algeria. I suspect that not too many people know that Jews from Libya were shipped to concentration camps. I mean, I think it's good to remember that. I mean, for example, we all know that the Jews of Corfu and the Jews of Saloniki were completely eliminated by themselves, but some of it also does take place in North Africa. Actually, there's a good book by Yossi Sukeri, who was a member of our school, that it's a fiction book, but it's a historical fiction, and I would advise people to read it about the interaction between Benghazi and Bergen-Belsen. It's a book from 2013 that one of us wrote. Right, the other thing I want to say is that, of course, Nazi Germany is physically present in the territory of Egypt in 1940, 1941. So, for example, at that moment in time, many Egyptian Jews already leave Egypt. If I have a partly Egyptian family in Australia, and they left at that time. So what I'm trying to say is that the Holocaust is not completely outside of our lives and domains. Arab states also, remember, they during the war they preferred to keep themselves neutral and out of the war rather than join forces with Britain that colonized them. It is understandable, of course, but you need to understand that from the perspective of Jews in the Arab Middle East, this was a little bit complicated. This neutrality, so to speak, it was not something that was supported by either anti-Zionist or Zionist Jews in the Middle East. I'll take just Egypt as a quick illustration to get a sense of the 1940s. The state of Egypt did not declare war on the Axis powers, but did expel or detain Germans and Italians that were physically present in Egypt, except, of course, for declared anti-Nazi or anti-fascist, and also say for German Jews and Italian Jews that were there. But the state of Egypt did declare war on Nazi Germany on the 24th of February 1945. So there was a declaration of war in February of 1945. The reason was that the state, Egypt wanted to secure a seat in the conference of the victorious powers after that, and you cannot be part of the conversation if you are not party to formally declare war against the Nazis. So that's when they did. When Egypt decided to declare a war against Germany, the prime minister of Egypt was assassinated at the same time, right? So why I'm saying it, this is something that I think many people don't know. Even as late as 1945, you still had constituencies within Egyptian society that still remained influential enough to assassinate a prime minister live, right? And they were unhappy with this modification and with this declaration of war against Nazi Germany. This state of affairs was complicated for Egyptian Jews. I mean, it was not something pleasant to be in the 1940s in Egypt, despite the fact that, of course, the war was elsewhere. I'm skipping here because I don't want to speak too much. I'm just saying that in Iraq in 1941, there was a pro-German coup a coup d'etat that was anti-British, of course. You'd have to remember that in 1941, Hajj Amin al-Hussein, who was exiled by the British already in 1937 from Palestine, was present on the ground in Baghdad, and he was an important member of this coup, right? Very soon after, 3 months later, he would go and find refuge in Germany. But what I'm trying to say, all this tension or Jewish Holocaust it has presence in the lives of Jews in the Middle East. Let me just finish here and say it was only Arab Jewish communists in a way because many Jews in the Arab world were overrepresented in communist movement. They were probably the single body that was completely and openly anti-German and anti-Nazi during the 1940s. Effectively, the only body that advanced resolutely the thesis that the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily a friend. This was a view that many people thought that the German enemy of colonial Britain can assist in demolishing colonialism in the Arab world. And it was very hard to come and convey the message that that's not necessarily so. And Marxist Jews in the Arab world usually try to convey a message to fellow nationalists, Muslim, Islamists, and anti-colonial constituencies of other persuasions, right, that Nazism is the highest or nastiest form of European colonialism or imperialism, which was not always an easy message to convey during the time, because it implied some cooperation with Britain, because also the Soviet Union collaborated with Britain against Nazi Germany. So this was all of these issues of the Jewish Holocaust. Now, despite everything that I just discussed, and until now, all of the above is secondary, because the history of Mizrahi Jews remains overshadowed by two other histories. The one is the genocidal Holocaust of European Jewry, the standard one that we know, and the second one is the Palestinian Nakba. This is the epic, okay? This is the epic, and the Mizrahi history is not on the same level. So what I'm suggesting is that between these domineering histories, Palestinian and Ashkenazi history, Mizrahi scholars and activists have attempted a reconstruction of their perhaps less calamitous collective history, though certainly no less significant, and this is as a means of socio-cultural reconstitution. Edward Said, Azmi Bishara, and other intellectuals correctly explained to us that the Jewish question, the European Jewish question, of late 19th century became the Palestinian question in the 20th century. It helped to produce the Palestinian question, the Jewish question of Europe. What I suggest is that this otherwise fine articulation overlooks a variable that the European Jewish question massively helped to create also the question of Arab Jews in the Middle East before and after 1948. So that's not Arab Jews in places surrounding Palestine. So the European Jewish question did not only create the Palestinian question, in some respects it created also the Arab Jewish question. But the dominant Zionist and Arab debate that exists out there revolves basically exclusively around the Holocaust Nakba axis, right? And as such, unfortunately, and even by definition, it's most smoke screens and even erases the Mizrahi question and the historical trajectory of Mizrahim before and after 1948. This is something that is regarded as peripheral. We are not part of the epic, Holocaust Nakba epic. We are always brushed aside a bit. The last thing I want to do is to say that the critical year for Mizrahi history and Arab Jews is 1937. 1937 witnessed the proposal by the British to partition Palestine into two states. This decision galvanized Arab support, and for the first time, I think, the Palestine question no longer was confined to a tension inside Palestine itself between Zionists and Palestinian Arabs. For the first time, the question became a regional issue. And here is when Arab Jews become important variable in everything that is happening. So this is the map. This is the suggestion of the British Peel Commission of 1937. It created an outrage in the Arab world. The idea that a slice of Palestine is going to become a Jewish state. I mean, this was it. And this created the most impressive, probably, anti-colonial revolt in the Middle East, the Palestinian revolt between 1937 and 1939, which enjoyed great support by states and societies surrounding Palestine, where Arab Jews lived. Now, let me just explain something. Most people out there have a different thesis about the regionalization of the Palestine question. I suspect that the dominant view out there among scholars and activists is that the regionalization of the question of Palestine happened in May 1948, when, after the British armed forces and civic administrative personnel exited mandatory Palestine, they left, right? And immediately after that, armed Iraqi, Egyptian, Syrian, and Transjordan and Lebanese forces crossed into the territory that was assigned to the Palestinian Arab state by the United Nations Resolution 181, the partition resolution. So people say, oh, here is the first moment there is a regional dynamic in the Middle East that is beyond the confined small territory of Palestine itself, because suddenly the question becomes regional. A Mizrahi counter thesis suggests that it is precisely the opposite. Precisely the opposite is the case. And this is, I think, a Mizrahi argument that what we call the regionalization of the Palestine question, first of all, was not armed or military, but the regionalization was sociopolitical. It took place on the realm of sociopolitics, not on the realm of military armed conflict, as was the case in 1948. It all happened more than 10 years before 1948. And finally, and this is very important to understand, the regionalization of Palestine question materialized upon the migration of the question of Palestine to neighboring Arab societies and states, rather than the other way around, that Arab armies enter Palestine. No, it happened when the question of Palestine was migrated itself to other Arab states surrounding Palestine. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm simply going to read some primary sources from the period itself that try to explain this dynamic, because it is absolutely critical to the question of Arab Jews and Mizrahim afterwards. So let's start with one illustration. It's a letter that was written from London to Washington. The British, the Foreign Office is trying to explain British policies in Palestine and the Middle East to the British ambassador in Washington, and that's what they write. I'm reading: the hostilities in Palestine threaten to become a cause of permanent unrest and friction throughout the Near and Middle East. Who can tell what the end might be if the bitterness of Arab nationalists against the Jews in Palestine were turned against the Jews in Iraq or elsewhere? His Majesty government is compelled to take the most sober view of the consequences which policy in Palestine may bring in countries beyond its own borders. Now, some of the people around here are historians of the Middle East, and they, for example, know what happened in Iraq 2 years after these words were written, basically a massacre of Jews, right? So this is written now 2 years before. 1939. In fact, this dynamic was predicted by the anti-Zionist British Jews, who insisted on introducing some conditions into the Balfour Declaration already in 1917. Those of you remember maybe that the Balfour Declaration, the establishment of the Jewish national home, was supposed to be done under two conditions: it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, of Palestinians. And the second condition was, or may prejudice the civil prejudice the rights of political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So what I'm suggesting here that actually the publication of the Balfour Declaration generated nothing in relation to the safety of Jewish communities in Europe. So in a way, Edwin Montague, that was the person that insisted on including the quintessential anti-Zionist British Jews, when he inserted this condition, right? And nothing happened to Jewish communities in Europe because of Zionism, right? But that's not the case in the Arab world, because in the Arab world, this is precisely what happened, that the situation worsened. So what was the dynamic that developed from late 1930s and during the 1940s? Simply a very simple sociological dynamic of a guilt by association. The risks of this phenomenon are present in every human society on earth, Manchester, New York, London, Jerusalem, Baghdad, everywhere, guilt by association. And I suggest to you that a phenomenon of guilt by association did manifest itself in the Middle East in relation to the Palestine question from 1937 onwards. I'm saying that Jews in the Middle East, already in 1929, felt it urgent existentially to publicly declare their disassociation from Palestine European Zionists. And here is a quote. It's very hard for me to see my own screen. So I'm going to try. I can't see the first line. How do I do it? How do I remove this?
Shall I read it?
Yes, read the, oh, here I can do. Zionism was founded by the Jews of Northern Europe, and the Jews of Damascus are totally estranged from it. We have come to declare to our fellow Arab citizens our attitude vis-a-vis the Zionist question and ask them to differentiate between the European Zionists and the Jews who have been living for centuries in these lands. We ask that the population and the press consider the Jews of Damascus to be Arabs, sharing completely all their sentiments in good times and in adversity. I'm telling you, when I read this primary source from 1929, I cry. I mean, for you, maybe just words, but I'm trying to, let's do an analogy, right? Imagine that the whole British society is going to be very, very, very pro-Palestine, right? It is going to be so pro-Palestine to an extent that we'll start to associate British Jews with Zionism, and it will create a situation whereby the minority British Jews will need to publicly declare to the majority society surrounding them that they need to disassociate themselves as British Jews from Zionism, right? This is unmanageable, right, this situation. But what you see in front of you is this situation where a minority group needs to plead vis-a-vis the majority strong group surrounding it, right, that it has nothing to do with everything that is happening in mandatory Palestine, including crimes that are happening there. So that's the beginning of the trajectory of Arab Jews. So, and it mostly happened later on. After 1937, the erosion of the distinction between Jews and Zionists and the conflation between Jews and Zionists was present among Zionists and also, unfortunately, among anti-Zionists in the Middle East. The erosion and the conflation was running back and forth across the Arab-Zionist divide, and it destabilized the collective Jewish existence and life in the Arab world. It was quite old. Now, the Zionists were not bothered at all by the development of this conflation between Zionists and Jews. Why? Because the conflation greatly assisted them to materialize the chief Zionist dictums, which are negation and liquidation of the so-called exile. Second, separation between Jews and non-Jews. That's what Zionism is all about. And also in some respects, the development assisted them to present their own answer to the Jewish question as if it is the only answer and also the majority answer, which of course was not the case in the late 1930s and early 1940s. So,
Shiko, I think you need to start
wrapping.
winding up.
Okay, I'm taking 4 more minutes until 6, and that's it.
Great.
Thank you so much. Right. So just read some people, very, very few, by the way, very few. It's interesting how in 2022, probably things like, wow, you didn't see it. And I'm telling you, at the time itself, people didn't see it. Here is someone who was stationed in Baghdad in 1937, and he writes to London, quote, the most serious aspect of the Palestine problem is that the communities concerned are not local entities, but have racial and religious affinities all over the world, and in particular that any exacerbation of the situation there reacts immediately, not only on the government and the Arab majority in Iraq, but on the tranquility of the Jewish minority community resident here in Baghdad as well. So this is 1937. Let's take one other quote.
You have not shared it on the screen, but you read it, but it wasn't on the screen.
Really? I see it on the screen.
Okay.
Can you see now? Another quote from 1938 by the Deputy Undersecretary of State for the Colonial Office. He writes, no British attention seems to be given to the situation of the average non-political Jew. In Egypt and Syria and other places in the Middle East, he writes, I know that the Jewish community in Egypt, with whose leaders I was in the most friendly terms, are seriously worried at the likelihood of anti-Semitic reactions, which they have successfully avoided. Indeed, the thing has been utterly unknown in Egypt, which are likely to emerge as a result of Zionist policies. Hitherto, the leading Egyptian Muslims, like their humble compatriots, have entertained most friendly feelings toward Jews. They are now genuinely aroused at the idea that fellow Palestinian Muslims are eventually going to be squeezed out of a country which they have inhabited for many centuries by immigrants who are regarded as being mostly communists. See what is going on here. This is 1938. You can see here someone who predicts the Nakba, squeezed out of the country, and also who pays attention to the fact that the opposition to Zionism identifies Zionism with communism. Okay? And then this is the last thing I'm reading. He writes, I'm convinced that if we stick doggedly to partition of Palestine, right? It will create a new and unfortunate attitude on the part of the Muslims and the Egyptian Copts to the Egyptian Jews. There seems to be every reason to believe that the same observation would apply throughout Arabia and Iraq. Why must we deliberately refuse to make any effort to find out how far Jewish sentiment and Zionist fanaticism are really identical? Final word. Partition in 1937 generated a situation of interaction between Zionism and Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism began to incorporate and reproduce the terms that were used by the Zionists, conflation between Jews and Zionists, and this explains part of the reason. It's not only reason, because the Zionists were also there, that created a situation whereby 500,000 Arab Jews, right? 2/3 of the Arab Jews became Israelis. So the last word I'm going to say, if you want to understand Mizrahi Jews and why they are Israelis, you need to understand that in many, many respects, they were made Israelis by Arab nationalism. This is something that sometimes people forget. Okay, I'm going to stop here. unfortunately, and hopefully I am going to get out of COVID too. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this amazing talk, Shiko. And there are some questions if you, yeah. Can I ask people who sent the questions to me to indicate by raising their hands? The first one, okay, I can see Les Levidow. Les, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, as you recounted the history, the Arab Jews had good reasons to regard the Zionist project as a threat, and including the prospect that they might be wrongly associated with that project and then be attacked by their fellow Arabs. But I want to ask whether that really happened. I mean, the most infamous occasion was the bombing of the Baghdad synagogue. But I've read that that was really a conspiracy by Mossad with some Iraqi racists who had other political motives for that attack. So, I mean, how did the fellow Arabs respond to their Jewish neighbors?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question because it demonstrates the fact that probably your knowledge of Mizrahi history is minimal. You don't know, yeah, but let me just say something here. I understand that sometimes it's hard for anti-Zionists to hear what I'm going to say now. Every Arab city in the Middle East, every Arab city in 9 Arab states included a degree of association of Jews and Zionists. Every, in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Syria, in Yemen, it happened, right? So the fact that, I mean, people don't know about it is I understand, right? Unfortunately, there's my talk that was, I had to cut it short because I probably couldn't plan everything properly. I addressed this issue quite extensively. And the only thing I want to tell you is that you need to understand that from the perspective of the Zionist movement, this was a desired objective. Because if you think about it from a Zionist perspective, a prerequisite for the success of the European Zionist movement is the fact that it can create a dynamic that will terminate exilic, so to speak. What exilic? Exilic collective Jewish life, right? In any place outside Palestine, Israel, right? So this is why the issue was there. And of course that they were involved to some extent, but in destabilizing Jewish life in the Middle East. But at the same time, the view sometimes among anti-Zionist constituencies in the West is that the 500,000 Ashkenazi Jews in Palestine, 500,000, right, are somehow they are magicians, right? They are able to somehow have a remote control, right, in Tel Aviv and control the domestic politics of 9 Arab states around them, right? And somehow can create a situation, maybe they can even upload Yemenite and Iraqi Jews into airplanes in the airports, right? Who's doing all of this, right? So what I'm suggesting that you need to understand the history of Arab Jews as a domestic history, right? It's not something alien. It's not history that is only stands in some correlation to what is going on with Zionism. It is domestic politics that are involved, and you have 2 parties to this tango. It's a tango. It's not one person cannot dance a tango. And the tango in the 1940s takes place between Euro-Zionism and Arab nationalism, and together they produce a dislocation of Arab Jews that, bear in mind, only materializes after the Nakba. It does not start before 1949. The Arab Jews have no physical relations to the Nakba in 1948. It all happens after that, right? So it's not only because of European Zionists. Unfortunately, fortunately, that's not the case.
There are a number of people waiting to ask their questions, but before I allow them, Ophira Gamliel, you had a question, but I don't see your hand. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for that. Well, the first one was partially answered, but just how do you view the situation of so-called Mizrahi Jews? By the way, I prefer Afro-Asian Jews or something like that in a wider context. How do you view it in relation to one, decolonization, the decolonization agenda in particular, but also post-colonialism and neocolonialism? So you partially addressed that issue. And the other part of the question is, how do you view Mizrahi Jews in the context of the global North and South divide?
Yeah, that's Ophira, of course, it's questions that maybe it's out of my league, but I'm going to try at least. Let's just speak about decolonization because it's something that interests, I think, the constituency and everybody. I think that the problem with the concept decolonization is that it's not clear enough. You know, I had a conversation with Chaim about 2 weeks ago in a different forum, and we were trying to maybe say we need to maybe do some conversation. This is in Hebrew, to explain to Hebrew speakers what exactly is anti-Zionism, right? What does it really mean, right? So decolonization. If you speak about decolonization of the mind or the curriculum or whatever decolonization, that's a piece of cake, right? But most people, when they think about decolonization, they think about anti-colonialism, right? What is decolonization? Anti-colonial Algeria, you fight, and the colonialists are going home. That's anti-colonialism 101, right? So the issue here is that when one says decolonization, you know, what does one mean exactly, right? Probably, I think that the most generous interpretation would be the removal of structures that generate inequality without requiring a physical relocation of even settlers. I think that that's the position of the Palestinian national movement from 1968, early 70s, one state solution, one secular state solution, although my view is that this is not going to deliver the outcome. That's maybe also one of the reasons why I'm not yet a member of the network, because I think that's as a prerequisite, but not a necessary but insufficient condition to get us out of the mess. And the other thing is that I don't think there is Mizrahi Jews are as divided as the 9 states from which they emerged, right? So if you take the 9 states that from where Mizrahi Jews emerged, are these states united? No, they are not united. Arab nationalism managed to generate a unitary dimension that brought the civil societies of these 9 states together? No. So they failed, and we failed, right? So definitely Mizrahi history is a history of failure, right? It's a history of failure, but this is why some constituencies, Mizrahi constituencies, would have different answer to your question about their allegiance to Afro-Asia, as you called it, right? There's no one answer. Yeah.
Thanks. Moshe Machover, please. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Chico, for a brilliant talk, very instructive. I have a question that is marginal, but actually it has to do with what Ophira just said. She insisted on operation rather than Arab or Mizrahi Jews. Mizrahi Jews certainly include Jews from non-Arab countries or non-Arab speaking or not. The most significant and important are, of course, the Jews of Iran. They are in Israel lumped together. They are considered as Mizrahi as Jews of Tunisia, but they are not Arab. And they have never been Arab. A separate question is to what extent, and I mean, you quoted the Syrian Jewish declaration, in which they identify as we are Arabs. I think, to the extent of my limited knowledge, this was rather rare, not only because they would consider themselves, I mean, the Jews of Baghdad would consider themselves as Baghdadi Jews, Iraqi Jews, in some respect, Babylonian Jews, which is an honorific, kind of definition. But very few would have regarded themselves as Arab. And by the way, very few non-Jewish Iraqis would have defined themselves primarily as Arab at that point before the mid-1950s. Anyway, but this is just a marginal remark. But my main question is, let us not conflate between Arab Jews or Jews of Arabic background and Mizrahi Jews, because the two categories are not identical.
Do you want to relate to this?
No, let other people speak.
Okay. Amiel Al-Kalai, welcome. Would you please unmute yourself?
Thank you, Chaim. Thanks, Chico. That was terrific. My question, I don't know if it's a kind of a question, it's a comment that one thing you didn't bring up, and I know you didn't have time, but the class structure within Jewish societies in those countries had a huge impact, because you had people with deep economic interests in the colonizing force, particularly Britain. And, the mass of people didn't have those interests. So there were all kinds of subtle and not so subtle allegiances, I think, that developed vis-a-vis Zionism, vis-a-vis all these other issues that really impacted the greater constraints that people had in which to identify at all, I think. So I just wanted to bring that up. I know you're well aware of it, but
Yes, thank you so much, Amiel. This is a very good question, and also because it's something that I think it's a belief that prevails among many constituencies, that in its extreme form led to the charge that the Jews were what we call capitalist compradors in Marxist theory. I don't know how many Marxists, well, Moshe is here, are left. Capitalist compradors in the sense that basically they were collaborators with colonialism. It's a dominant view among, definitely it was a dominant view in the 70s and 80s among central constituencies inside the Arab national movement. And also it was very easy to describe them as such. After reading the works of such esteemed scholars as Zach Lockman, Joel Bainin, people that dealt with the class history of the Middle East, I mean, what I can tell you that by and large, with the exception maybe of Algerian Jews, that was a separate issue with the citizenship and stuff, right? By and large, right, the difference of the class composition of the Jewish community, right, the class composition of internal class composition of the Jewish community was not that greatly different from the class composition of the non-Jewish community. In Egypt, it was a little bit different because it's true that it was a diverse community and you had there some Jews, including Ashkenazi Jews, right, that were a little bit more affluent, some do. So there is a bit of a statistical anomaly in a way, right? In Iraq, only in Baghdad, you had a little bit of that, right? And it is the case that the Jews were, in terms of, for example, formal education, were a little bit, had more formal education when compared to the majority society, but there are not only them, other minority groups too. So what I'm suggesting, Amel, is that actually it does not explain the outcome at stake, okay? So you cannot explain, right, the alienation, so to speak, of the minority Jewish community in the Arab world while utilizing as an independent variable, right, class dynamics. So what I'm suggesting is this. Arab Jews are not capitalist compradors. They are not fifth columnists. They are not collaborators with Zionism. They are not all of these, you know, assumption that sometimes you find in nationalist-centered historiography of the history of Jews in the Middle East, which, by the way, changes quite a lot now in the Arab world. The Arab world of today, Morocco, Egypt, Iraq have, sorry, Avi Schleim is here. You have a lot of new historians and critical sociologists. These are Arab scholars that in Arabic reinterpret, right, the history of Jews in the Middle East in terms that are very much revisionary. And these are terms, by the way, that correspond with theses that were written by Mizrahi Jews for some times. They reach, there is a bit of a view like that. That's my impression from the development in the last 10, 20 years as far as the historiography of Arab Jews is concerned.
Thanks.
And welcome to Avi Schleim. Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you. A really profound and illuminating talk. And you mentioned Ella Shochat and her important work on the Arab Jew. She made another important point, which is the parallels between Palestinian history and the history of the Jews in the Arab lands. The dispossession of the Palestinian Jew, of the Palestinians from Palestine, and then the uprooting of the Jews from the Arab lands to bring them forcibly to, in some cases, as in Iraq, forcibly to Israel. And she argues that the same European colonial mindset and the same European-style colonial institutions that dispossessed the Palestinians were also the ones that uprooted the Arabs from the Jews from the Arab lands and brought them to Israel and then treated them in the racist way that you described. Do you see this as a valid parallel?
Yes, I do. Ella, of course, is a sister, so I know her 30 years. So I agree with the thesis. The only thing I'm saying is that I just want to emphasize something. We today started something that is three-part, right? I'm not alone. So I explicitly said that this talk today is going to be devoted a little bit more to the pre-1950s history of Jews in the Arab Middle East. Just remember, Avi, that the next two talks, 2/3 of the whole series, are going to discuss post-1948 Israel, which is a topic that, I think you analyzed. I mean, the only reservation I would have in relation to the thesis of Ella is that I think she is correct, right? She is very correct, 100% correct in relation to the moment whereby Iraqi, Egyptian, and other Jews are physically present in the infant Israel, as I call it, or the formerly Palestine, now Israel. At that moment in time, all the apparatus that you discussed that in a way was applied to Palestinian, indigenous Palestinians in the territory of Palestine itself, right, was applicable also to them. The Zionists definitely did have an interest to destabilize Jewish life in the neighboring Arab states. I mean, also remember, I mean, 6 million Jews were no longer there. They were supposed to be part of the project in Palestine, and they were now gone, right? So the Zionist movement definitely did have an interest in importing workers and demographic and labor needs to bring in Jews from elsewhere, given the fact that all the other reservoir, so to speak, was not there. So they did, of course, initiate all kinds of dynamics, right, that try to separate, to introduce separation between Jews and non-Jews also in states neighboring Palestine. But they were not alone. They, in a way, there were subnational constituencies that in some respects, I mean, I don't think that, for example, if you study the history of Arab Jews from the perspective of Arab Jews, then I can tell you that, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is a Zionist group. The policies that they actually implemented on the ground in Egypt are Zionist. There's no difference. And even secular, so to speak, secular, ultra-nationalist, sub-national constituencies, for example, in Baghdad, right? They can be secular in terms of their declaration or ideology, but in terms of the policies that they executed on the ground in relation to the minority community, they conflated Jews and Zionists exactly like the Zionists. I mean, they did think that Iraqi Jews are a fifth column. So not all of them, I'm not saying all, some constituency that were there. And it is this joint dynamic that is able to produce the dislocation or the dispersal, right? It's a tango. There's not, the Zionists cannot dance a tango alone. The Arab nationalists cannot dance a tango alone. They need each other to generate this dislocation. That's my understanding of what happened in the 1940s. So Ella is correct, but not completely.
There is a question from Hagit Borer. Please unmute yourself, Hagit.
Okay, thank you very much, Chico. I'm going to raise something. It's a direct continuation for what Moshe said, to some extent also Fira, and it's a topic that we already discussed, which is why I waited to ask the question, because, and that is the extent to which a category such as Arab Jews or even Mizrahim is not something that has been in fact created effectively by Israel through its discriminatory policies, and the extent to which the unified components of some of these communities, they have been brought together not through some internal commonality that shares, let's say, Baghdad and Casablanca, which there isn't very much of, but rather by the unified particular treatment that they were given. Because if I think, for instance, about Morocco, in Morocco, the only people who associate themselves as Arab are the ruling class. The rest of the population, over 90%, identify themselves as Berber and perceive themselves as under a colonial rule of the Arabs. And the Jewish population in Morocco, by and large, was not associated with the Arab ruling class. It was quite well integrated into local Berber communities. And so the profile, that it's very different, for instance, from the European classical profile of the Jew who is associated with incurring favor with the local feudal authorities. And so I don't know to what extent a notion such as Arab Jew could uniformly really bring these communities together. And while I think there is a very powerful, important experience that brought them together, but the experience happened as part of Israeli society, as the part of being shipped into the same hellholes in the desert or whatever, and the rest of what's happened in the last 70 years.
So this is interesting because, I mean, Chaim mentioned this anthology that we compiled of primary writings by Jews, it's true, not in North Africa. It was between Egypt and Iraq.
You know, the thing is, Morocco was missing from your own discussion.
Yeah. No,
that it's really it's focused on the Middle East. But
yes,
huge portion of Mizrahi Jews are from Morocco.
Yes, first of all, yes, although definitely correct. The only thing is that what I'm saying, but the Moroccan Jews in the I'm not a specialist on Moroccan Jews, but they reflected the dynamics that were prevailing among the majority society around them. They were not different. So their level of Arabness, so to speak, corresponded to the level of Arabness of everybody around. They up or down, they were part of what was going on there, right? So that's why.
But they don't even speak Arabic. They don't speak Arabic.
You know, anyway.
They speak Berber or they speak French.
I want to say one thing. Many, you can see Jews indigenous to the Middle East using the collective signifier Mizrahim, the collective signifier for all Asian and African Jews. You can see these collective signifiers used by such Jews already in the first part of the 20th century. Even Ottoman Palestine, you can see it.
In Ottoman, it's an Ottoman notion. That's the thing.
Right. So it is there. And the last thing I want to say, what you are asking also is also a question in the social sciences, right? About the level of generality, because I can tell you also that even people in Marrakesh are not the same, you know, or people they are different, right? So what I'm suggesting to you is the experiences shared by the 9 Jewish communities of the Arab Middle East before 1948 outweigh the experiences that differ them. That's the only thing I'm saying. Iraqi Jews and Yemenite Jews are not the same. Moroccan Jews and Libyan Jews are not the same, right? Of course they're not the same, but they do have a sufficient amount of traces, cultural, lingual, religious, of course, that does generate a degree that you can say that they belong to you can apply a collective signifier to denote them, right? Because the other possibility is that, and it happens, that also historiographers, scholars, academics, all they are doing is fragmentation, right? It's like a salami system, fragmentation of the 800,000 Jews in the Middle East. They're not the same, don't generalize, don't compare, they are Iraqi, they are Yemenite, we can't talk. We can't.
Shiko, that's not what I said. I didn't say they're not the same. I said they're the same as being created by Israel.
There are other questions, so can I go to Sadia Agus? Can you unmute?
Hi, everybody. It's Axus. Just want to, I have a question about the Arab new historiography, working on the history of the Mizrahim and Arab Jews. Just want to correct something. I mean, we speak Arabic in Morocco. I'm from the region. And it's true that North Africa is different. It's completely different. And Algeria, particularly Algeria, is a different issue. And but the point that was made about how, because I'm working on anti-Semitism within Arab nationalism or Arab intellectuals. And it's an important point for me today to understand, which I agree actually, how Arab nationalism and Zionism created in some ways, or the dislocation of Arab Jews. And this is like a question that was always in my mind. Why the dislocation? What happened? And how come we, you know, this population that was part of the society disappeared? That, you know, today we have just like, we have cemeteries and synagogues, old synagogues that are, you know, that remain. My question is about this new regard of Arab historians. What can we do, you know, like to like get new historians from Israel. You have the Palestinians and this new discussion and research on the new regard on the history of the Jews in Arab lands. What can we do with it? Like getting outside this forum, which is quite important. That anyway, how in some ways, how can we win and train the new generation? And bring together the history of Arab, the Mizrahim and Arab world and the Palestinians and Israel,
Well, the best, the first step is probably to try and resolve the Palestine question, because once you do that, that's a prerequisite, or as long as the Nakba is ongoing, so to speak, if the Palestine, then it mutes everything. It mutes, by the way, it mutes even in a way that is counterproductive to the muter. You understand? It's not that it can definitely be muter. And you are in Paris. I mean, Sadia, and I didn't see you 7 years or so, but you do remember what happened now with the exhibition at the Institut du Monde Arabe, right? I mean, actually what happened there was the precise opposite of what we discuss here, that there was completely, and I'm not getting into the issue of boycottable or not boycottable, that's a separate issue, right? What I'm trying to say is that the problem is that when you try to write a joint history, right, of, I don't know, Jews of Iraq, sometimes you bump into the oppression of the Palestinian people, and unfortunately, as long as this is not resolved, there's no bypass road, and we are stuck. That's the problem. We are stuck.
Thanks. There is a question relating directly to this by Glyn Secker. Glyn, would you like to ask your question, or shall I read it?
Thanks, Chaim. The question was, please, can you say something about the social and political relations between the Israeli Mizrahi and the Israeli Palestinians, and what do you see as the underlying drivers? Thank you.
You are talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel and Mizrahi citizens of Israel. Am I correct?
Yes.
Tense, I mean, as tense as the relationship between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. I mean, there is a collective identity that is, for better or worse, right? But factually is linked to nationalism, right? And the nationalism is not the same. In saying that, I'm not saying that it doesn't maintain also relationship with the colonial question, but that's a separate issue. And because of this differing nationalist affiliation, right? This affiliation generate tension between the two, but this is politically. But I can also say, by the way, I'm using the words of the Deputy Undersecretary of State from 1938. Remember, I read a piece that he wrote in 1938. He used the phrase, the average non-political Jew. There are also Palestinian citizens of Israel and Mizrahi citizens of Israel that wake up in the morning and, because the first thing that they have in mind is, okay, what I'm supposed to do in order to provide for my 3, 4, 5 children. So in relation to the realm of labor, outside of, so to speak, formal politics, sometimes you do see quite a lot of interactions, and actually that sometimes there's not such huge nationalist divisions between them in terms of their live daily experience. But to tell you that the situation is good, no, it's bad. Yeah, not so much. I mean, insufficient linkages.
I want to ask the last question. I'm using my prerogative as chair because there are no other questions. And it appears to me quite incredible that the Jews of Israel, and importantly, you know, the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of those who perished in the Holocaust, have managed to, in a sense, come to a total positive relationship with Germany. Germany is not a problem for those people in any way that one can discover very easily. But that Israelis, and you just talked about Mizrahis, are not in a position, because of Zionism, to, in a sense, forget what the Palestinians didn't do to them. You know, after all, the Palestinians didn't do the Nakba to the Israelis, it was the other way around. And yet there is no forgiveness to the Palestinians for being the victims of Zionism. This is I wonder what you think about that.
I mean, to be perfectly honest with Chaim, I mean, I think that you definitely have more capabilities to make sense of the issue than me, because I'm simply puzzled as you are in relation to this perpetual, so to speak, phenomenon, right? The fact that that's the situation. But at the same time, I'm not completely surprised, because I mean, if you think about Arab societies and states surrounding Palestine, right? In a way, kin or relatives or family, right? I mean, the amount of support that the Palestinian people get from them is really insignificant, minimal, and sometimes even non-existent at all, right? So as long as the Palestinian people are left alone, right, to try and counter the formidable power of Israel, right, the chances are relatively slim, right? And in many respects, I mean, I think that what you're saying is that there is a need to restore in Palestinian-Arab relations. You understand what I'm saying? The relation between Palestinian Arabs and non-Palestinian Arabs, which is really not working properly as far as I can see. I mean, it would be as if my brother, you know, is going to have some problem with his mortgage, right? And I am not going to assist because I don't care. You understand what I'm saying? So I think that this is a key issue to try and counter the perpetual fact that the Palestinians are not forgiven by who? By their Israel. I mean, why would they? You understand? I mean, the Israelis don't have an interest in that.
Well, I want to thank very much, Chico, for all your efforts, despite the fact that you're obviously visibly ill. You've managed to hold us for 2 hours. So I think it's I think it's your fault that people come back with questions. Thank you very, very much. And we all hope that you will be well soon.
Yes, and of course, remember that it's only the first 1 out of 3, and I hope you will come and hear Hila and Zvi, because they are nicer than me by far.
The next session of this series is on the 23rd in 10 days at 6 o'clock rather than 5. Please register. Come back. Thank you all for sticking for such a long time with Chico. He is an Herculean hero. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci.
Thank you so much. Bye. Bye. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Merci.
Chico.
כן, אני מנסה לקרוא את הצ'אט. I didn't have any chance to read the chat at all, so...
Yeah, I know. There were a lot of questions.
Can you save it?
Ilan Leibovich wanted to ask many questions, but in the end didn't ask them. So I'm sorry about that.
Chico, it's Paul.
Yeah. Hi, Barbara. How are you?
He's talking with him. No, I know, but he asked me a question.
No. So yeah, thank you so much, Chaim, and David, of course, standing there in the back and taking care of everything. I mean, I truly didn't expect to have 90 people or something. I don't know.
Over 100.
Over 100.
Over 100. Wow.
Yeah.
So it's quite. I mean, you know, because you're doing this thing. Is it okay? No.
It's perfect. I couldn't believe that in your position, in your condition, you could deliver this over 2 hours. I know I'm much better physically, but I couldn't do it. You know, this is incredible.
No, it was good, and I just feel because there was so much more to say also. But never mind, it's a good start.
Yeah, it's a very good start.
And inshallah, I hope people join Hila and Tzvi because they are. It's very interesting what they have to say. I do already know. And I really thank everybody that attended. I don't take it for granted.
Mabruk.
Okay, so we'll be in
And
touch. Thank you.
I'm curious, Chico, I'm curious, how did you get your nickname?
Moshe becomes Moshiko, becomes Shiko.
It sounds like
it's
Spanish.
And it happened before I had consciousness. That's I'm called by also. That's the way I'm called. Not never heard. Nobody called me my real name, even my parents. So.
Right.
All righty. Bye.
Okay. Be well.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Yeah.